Up and running. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Anybody here ever read something written by William Shakespeare? Or perhaps hear something that was written by William Shakespeare?
I once heard something, yes.
Yes? Yes?
Yeah.
How do you know he wrote it?
Oh,
Because it says so.
It says it in the program, right? Or it says it in the
Yeah.
book,
Right.
right? I mean, has anybody heard that there is actually a great deal of controversy?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I mean, a great deal of controversy within the academic world. It's how you stay employed, of who wrote all the plays of Shakespeare. Why would it be a question? I mean, why not just say, well, it's in a book that says Shakespeare. Why are we arguing about this? Apart from keeping employment if you're an academic English major.
Because he didn't exactly write them down and sign them and, authenticate it and
Right.
whatever else people do now.
Right. We don't have notarized manuscripts with his name on them. The body of literature is also just massive. I mean, he was a prolific writer at a time when you didn't have that many prolific writers. We don't know much else about him and his origins to explain where he would have gotten the skill to write such works and such poetry. He sort of comes out of nowhere. And, well, how did this guy, end up writing what is now considered to be the greatest single author's contribution to English literature of all time, and then just disappear? It just doesn't make sense. So people advance that there may have been a collective that were writing these things. There may have been things that were being worked on and edited collaboratively, or that it may have been written by Francis Bacon, who everybody knows was smart, so maybe he did it, because we don't know this other guy was definitively smart, so we can't believe he did. And you end up with a lot of doubt. Who likes Shakespeare?
no.
No, not your cup of tea?
No.
Right, but many people do. Like I said, it's sort of universally considered to be one of the greatest collections of literature written by a single author in the entire history of English. So a lot of people seem to like Shakespeare. Does it matter who wrote it to whether or not you enjoy the play?
No.
Right? When you go to see Hamlet, if it said on the program Francis Bacon, would you say, well, I don't want to watch this?
Yeah.
I mean, something written by Francis Bacon, I mean, that's just going to be rubbish, isn't it? No,
Right.
to be or not to be. No. If Shakespeare had written it, I'd like it. But if Bacon wrote it, no, it's not. No?
No.
So why do people argue with passion and vigor and theological weight who wrote our book? Right?
Because we're not talking about Shakespeare.
Because we're not talking about it. Seems to be a slightly different
Yes.
kettle of fish,
Yes.
to use an idiom that may not be exactly the most respectful. But what makes this different then?
Because we're talking about whether this was authored
This
by
is-
God.
So when we talk about authorship, we're talking about divine authorship. Okay, so why do we care then about Moses? Right? Oh, I'm sorry, are those synonymous?
Yeah.
God and Moses?
God spoke to Moses and told him what to write.
Did he?
Yes,
Let's-
on Mount Sinai.
Let's find out in today's Torah portion.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Well, let's find out what the Torah itself
Yeah.
says about its authorship,
Yeah.
because that might be a good place to start.
Yes.
Because many of us come with preconceived notions and preconceived ideas of what we are supposed to believe, often that are not based on the text itself or on commentary, but are based upon our community, or our reaction to those who often attack the assumptions, which often those attacks are not, shall we say, respectful. Many people that attack the Mosaic or divine authorship of the Bible are not doing so because they are interested in the analysis of an ancient and revered text, but are doing so because they would like to disprove an ancient and revered text. But we can't let that tint of discussion tint our understanding of what is sacred to us. So we have to look at the question itself of who wrote it, from the Torah's position and from our classical tradition's position.
You're about to shake up all my beliefs.
I don't know.
this morning.
I don't know what you believe before we start. I'm hoping to make you think about why Torah is important. That maybe will go beyond just what does the copyright page say.
Okay.
Right? There's a wonderful episode of a British comedy called Red Dwarf. Not very popular in the States. It had a very good run back in England. By good run, I mean there were like 40 episodes. That's good in England. And there was a great episode where they had this little fake newscast from the year like 2300 or whatever, where they said an amazing archaeological discovery in the Sinai Peninsula. A new page of the Bible was discovered, which reads, "To my darling Candy, all characters and events portrayed in this book are fictitious, and any." And they said, and if the page has been universally condemned by religious leaders, da, 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 da. I mean, that kind of page would probably be upsetting, yes. But what our tradition and what the text itself believes about itself shouldn't shake us, unless it's to shake us from complacency. Okay, so we are in the book of Devarim, right? We are in the last book of the Torah, the fifth book, and we're going to start at the beginning of this book. So we are on page 981, which is Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1. Do we need to do rock, paper, scissors for readers, or? Kathy, please.
Go ahead.
These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan. Through the wilderness.
Hold on a second. Who's talking?
These are the words of Moses.
So these are the words of Moses. Let's do a little grammar here. These are words of Moses, right? Who wrote this sentence? Just do me the grammar, right? Who wrote the sentence?
Probably not Moses.
Probably not. Why not Moses?
We tend not to speak in the third person.
Exactly, because unless you have a strange affectation, Rabbi Neely wrote on the board, it's not a sentence you're likely to hear me say. And since Moses is written in third person, it seems a little odd. It seems a little odd that Moses is writing about Moses by saying Moses. But, well, let's save the but for later. All right, so just want to make sure we picked out that immediately. How many people, no show of hands, but just in your own mind, how many people ever noticed that the book of Devarim, the last section of the Torah, begins with a sentence that doesn't sound like Moses himself should have written it? I probably just went right through it, right? Elena Devarim, da-da-da-da-da. We just went right through that verse thinking, okay, we got the next book going, let's go, and we're going to wrap this whole story up. And it didn't even occur to us, wait, what's that third person doing there? All right, Kathy.
Through the wilderness in the Arabah near Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Lavan, Harazos, and Dizahab, it is 11 days from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea to the Mount Seir, by the Mount Seir route. It was in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, that Moses addressed the Israelites in accordance with the instructions that the Lord had given him for them, after he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and King Og of Bashan, who dwelt in Ashtaroth and Edrei. On the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this teaching.
All right. He said, all right, so we got a lot of third person going on in this. And stylistically, this sounds like a summary that came after the whole thing was done. Right, that this is an introduction written as a prologue after what comes next. Right, this doesn't sound like the introduction of a speech that I would be giving. Here we are today, standing after 40 years, da 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 da, and then I launch into my speech. This is somebody else providing an introduction to a recording of a speech that was done earlier. Right, it's the documentary style. I don't mean documentary hypothesis. The documentary style. Ken Burns. On the before Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. The battle had been very important as a turning point for getting support for the Union Army against the South. Da, 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 da. And here, if only we had the recording of the Gettysburg Address. Right. Instead, we have a copy of the Gettysburg Address, which may or may not be what Lincoln actually said. That's another question for authorship, by the way. All the accounts of the Gettysburg Address that appeared in the newspaper the next day were completely different
Oh,
So
eyewitnesses.
eyewitnesses, exactly right. And unfortunately, Lincoln himself did not leave a full text manuscript of what he wrote. So we're going off the best understanding of what he actually must have said based upon the convergence of all of those accounts. But we're not here to talk about Lincoln. But maybe Devarim is just continuing the same style as the whole first sections, right? Because remember, the whole first section of the Torah is all about, and God said to Moses, right? So Moses has been writing in third person for a long time, hasn't he? Right? It doesn't say, and then God said to me, tell the children of Israel. It says, and then God said to Moses, say to the children of Israel. So maybe we're making too much of a big deal about third person, because Moses hasn't been talking first person, except for very rare quotes. And it's not an issue. Keep reading.
The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb.
First
saying,
person plural.
You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Start out and make your way to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors in the Arabah, the hill country, the Shephelah, the Negev, the seacoast, the land of the Canaanites, and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates.
And by the way, a few years ago, we did a study about what that map looks like. So I'll refer you to that class.
See, I placed the land at
Wait,
your
I
disposal.
place? Okay. Keep going.
Go take possession of the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to assign to them and to their heirs after them.
All right, so this is, who's talking in this paragraph?
The
Right.
Lord spoke to us, saying, well, he's quoting God.
Who's the us?
Not, well, but he says, God spoke to, Lord our God spoke to us. And then
Who's
he says,
us?
See, I placed the land at your
Right,
disposal.
right, right. So the
Go
I
take
placed,
possession of the Lord.
exactly. The I placed is God speaking.
Right.
Who is the us speaking?
Moses and
Entire
everybody.
children of Israel.
The entire children of Israel, including Moses, the
Right,
actual
it's us.
speaker, right? So this is Moses quoting what God had said to him, right? And saying, God told me to tell you, God, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But now we get to the next verse. We're on verse 9 at the top of 984.
Thereupon I said to you,
Who's the I in that sentence?
Moses,
Moses.
I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. The Lord your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you as he promised you. How can I bear unaided the trouble of you and the burden and the bickering? Pick from each of your tribes men who are wise, discerning, and experienced, and I will appoint them as your heads. You answered me and said, what you propose to do is good.
All right.
It's not exactly how I remember that.
That's not how you remember that?
No, I thought that we had this whole big thing in Yitro.
So there's
Sounds like two incidents to me.
it sounds like two incidents. I mean, we've got a whole bunch of questions of bickering, but we have the story in the parasha of Yitro, where Jethro, his father-in-law, notices that he's being overburdened and makes a suggestion.
Right.
But he's not mentioning that here.
No.
But who's talking here?
He is.
Who's he?
Moses.
Right, we got to be clear on our pronouns
Yes.
here, right?
Moses, I.
I. Do we have a sentence here that says, and God told Moses to say, thereupon I said to you?
No.
So whose words are these?
Yes.
Is this Moses relaying God's words? In the second section we've read here. The first section, clearly, I will, da-da-da-da-da was God. But in this second section, is this Moses saying, God told me to say to you, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself?
No, because this was, I think this was Moses speaking to God when he said, I cannot bear the burden of you myself.
So we get the quote, I cannot bear the burden of these people, when we are talking at the incident of the quail, right? When the spirit of Moses is distributed among the other people and they begin to prophesy. But we get the incident of all of the judges being distributed among the people way back at the giving of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. Is Moses going senile here and he's making up his history? Or did God tell him to say it in this way, and therefore it's perfectly fine that the two events seem a bit strange? And what happened to Jethro? The guy who originally brought this idea, and who gave approval the people gave approval to the new judicial system, if the people had said, no, 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 Moses, you keep burying us all by yourself, we don't want to distribute the judges and have the hierarchy thing, would that have been okay?
And it's also, I'm not answering your question, but it's also rather convenient that none of the people there know what happened. These aren't the same people.
A very good point. We are 40 years later, remember our little introductory line, and the people who were there were either very, very young or dead. Because the ones who were old enough to have been adults when they heard it have died, and the ones who weren't old enough to have ended up being forced to die before the end were young, and therefore their testimony might be a little suspect. All right, so what do we make of these words? Well, as usual, let's wade into what our commentaries have said about this, because believe it or not, we're not the first people to notice this, nor were the Wissenschaft people of the 1800s who began the attack on the unified authorship of the Bible the first people to notice it. This unusual phrasing and slightly incongruous storytelling has been noticed since we began to read the Torah. So this should not come as a shock. If it comes as a shock, it means you haven't been reading your classical commentaries, because this has been talked about for a couple thousand years at least that we have records of. All right, so first.
In my opinion, these words are the laws recorded in chapters 12 through 26.
All right, so let's start off a little bit mundane, right? Ele Devarim, right? Our first two words. These are the words. Which words that Moses spoke? Or are you talking about the list of place names and then we're done? Or are we talking about the entirety of the book of Devarim and we're just using the word words sort of almost humorously because it's a lot more than just a few words? Or are we just talking about the commandments that are going to be listed in more detail later, or the narrative that is now coming in this first part of Devarim? What words are being referred to by the word words? Everyone follow the use of the word 3 times in one sentence, right? Where are the Devarim? And Ibn Ezra's opinion is, what's that?
It's the laws.
It's the laws, right? That the laws that come later are the words that are being referred to, and that would make the core of Devarim, the core of the words of the book of Devarim, the chapters that detail the mitzvah. Make sense? Maybe? Maybe. Okay. Or
Rabbi Shimon said, when the Holy One, blessed be he, told Moses to repeat the Torah, he was unwilling to rebuke Israel for the evil they had previously done.
Right. So if you keep reading this introductory chapter, Moses very quickly goes much beyond saying, you guys were wearing me out and bickering, and starts getting quite precise in his description of the failings of the nation. So those are the words, according to Rabbi Shimon, that are being introduced here. The words of rebuke.
This may be compared to a student who, walking with his teacher, noticed a hot burning coal lying in the road and, thinking it was a precious gem, picked it up and burnt himself.
Ouch.
Sometime later, he was again walking with his teacher and noticed a precious gem lying in the road. Thinking that it was a hot burning coal, he feared to touch it.
Hence the expression, once burnt, twice shy, right?
Thus his teacher said to him, pick it up, for it is a sparkling jewel. Similarly, Moses argued, when I said to Israel, hear now you rebels, in Numbers, I was punished. How then can I think to rebuke them now? God said to Moses, do not be uneasy.
Okay, so God, according to this midrash, God tells Moses, you need to repeat the Torah, right? And Moses goes, but there's a lot of rebuke involved in repeating the Torah and pointing out the mistakes of what we've done along the way and what you're likely to end up doing.
And then when I did those mistakes, I got punished because now you tell me I can't go into
Yeah.
the land.
And the last time I chewed them out,
Oy.
you chewed me out. So I don't want to touch that. I want to go there. And God instead says, don't worry about it. Go ahead and speak.
Yeah, you've already been punished. There's nothing else I can do.
There's always something worse, but make sure our kids always know that too. You think this punishment's bad. So who then is composing this speech?
Well, then we're back to God.
Really?
Yes, because Moses is simply going to tell them what all transpired. All that was.
But
it's Moses talking.
So Moses is repeating the Torah, right? That's the introduction here. That's why Deuteronomy is often called Mishneh Torah, right? The second Torah, the repetition of the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
But does he repeat the Torah?
No.
Right? Does he quote
No.
the first 4 books?
No.
So
No, there's a lot of paraphrase.
there's a lot of paraphrasing. And as we're also going to see, there's some new material. So for a repetition, it's not just like hitting the rewind button and then hitting play. It's not even just a cut and paste job from the highlights or the commandments of the first section of the Torah that's now being restated here. As we just saw, there seem to be some variances almost between some of the narratives. And that gets repeated when we go into the story of the spies. All of a sudden, it is the people's idea to have spies come out. But when we read in the book of Numbers, it was suggested from the leadership, so to speak. So what do we do? Indeed, Abarbanel asked this very question.
How can Moses claim that these appointments were his own idea when Exodus 18 tells us that Jethro suggested?
Right? It was our question that we came up with as well. We're in good company. Abarbanel has excellent questions, right? And furthermore, we're going to give a proposal to this coming again from Ibn Ezra.
Moses began to explain to the Israelites' children who had been born in the wilderness what had happened to their parents. He also repeated to them all the laws, including the 10 Commandments. Their parents had heard these directly from the mouth of the Lord, and now they too must hear them from a trusty messenger.
Right? That's based off Proverbs. So why the whole restatement? Why have the book of Devarim at all?
So that the kids know that
You need it for the next generation, right? You have to retell the Torah in every generation. I think we say something like that during Passover, in order that every generation experiences and understands it. Right? We try to recapture the giving of the Torah every single week with the way the Torah service is orchestrated to try and get some of that feeling. And according to Ibn Ezra, this is Moses' restatement for the benefit of the kids who are now adults, but the kids who were perhaps not born or were too young to really understand the experience of Mount Sinai. So who composed it? The Devarim section, the Moses' restatement. What's that?
Moses.
I mean, is it a problem if this is Moses' restatement? Recapitulating of the Torah. Is that a problem?
No, because really it sets up exactly how things are always going to go. That generation heard it directly, but that's a one-time event, and so all subsequent generations are going to have to hear it from somebody else. And by nature of that, you get what they've learned or experienced as they relate to it, and then that's what they pass to you. I mean, you always get that.
You always are going to get a layer of interpretation for every moment of transmission.
Back to the witnesses thing.
Right.
Everybody had a different thing of what they heard.
Right. But we don't adjudicate based upon the 9th generation's interpretation of interpretation of interpretation of interpretation. When we wanted to,
that's why we had the first 4 books.
That's why we had the first 4 books that are fixed. Maybe it's confusing, right? Yeah, it's hard. Well,
yeah, when we do these reviews and discussions, I find it helpful, and in fact, we often do it, to sort of think of it in the context of human phenomena,
Mhm.
right? And is there a comparable human phenomena
Right.
where this happens? And I find myself thinking as we're reading this that cause and effect is not always linear,
Mhm.
and that in terms of the recollection of events, it gets impacted by additional events. So
Mhm.
one of the things that just came to mind, right, was the decision to make the draft
Mhm.
prior to World War II passes by one vote, right? But then we have Pearl Harbor and everything that happened with the World War and the impression, right? So one could say that the passing of the draft was by the leadership
Mhm.
pushing it through.
Right.
But then after the subsequent events, it was the people that mobilized for the war.
Right.
Now, it's not accurate, but there is something to that phenomena that's being described. So I don't know if that is analogous to this, but that's what came to mind for me.
There is a very real human tendency to remember.
Yes.
Right. That when we remember the past, and actually Pixar's latest movie Inside Out does a good job of capturing this in a slightly humorous way. When we remember the past, our own past or what we've learned, we will often remember it based upon things that have happened after the moment we first experienced it.
Yes.
That will vigorously change, sometimes subtly change, our memory of what actually happened. And that doesn't necessarily make us wrong. It means we're not very reliable when it comes to being a witness for a crime. But the understanding that comes out of that experience and that memory can be clarified ex post facto by more information, more reflection, more thinking. And you often see this when people say, we'll laugh about this one day.
Yes.
How can I possibly laugh about this horrible situation that I'm going through right now, this giant travel snafu or something? But we do, because with the distance of time and the remembering that the consequences were never nearly as bad as what we thought they were likely to be at the time, and the inconvenience was really not that bad, and the experiences that came out of it and the adventure that was formed, eventually, what was a horrible experience at the start ends up being a favorite memory.
Someone will like my house eventually when they finish it.
I can't guarantee that. But you're already laughing.
Yes, it is, because that's exactly right. When you're living through it, it's so difficult, but sometimes you do look back and say, it was a good thing that it happened.
And that doesn't make the retelling with the humor a bad retelling.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you are lying or deceiving or altering or changing. It just means this is the way it needs to be retold now.
Well, and really the most current research on memory
Mhm.
is not that we hit a switch and it's played back.
Right.
But that we remember it, and we reconstruct it
Correct.
every time, and so naturally there are changes.
Absolutely.
Because you're remembering it at a different state.
There was a wonderful study recently done, recently to my memory, where they took people and asked them if they had ever been in a hot air balloon trip. And none of them, the participants had been in a hot air balloon trip, but they had gotten pictures from the family of them as child, and they used Photoshop to put them into a picture of them in a basket of a hot air balloon. And a huge percentage, I can't remember exactly how much, because my memory's a bit loose, after being shown the picture, began to remember the flight. And it began to fill in details of, because it was late, because the wind was bad when we started, or my sister's not in the picture because she was over at a friend's house and so she didn't get to go. People began to reconstruct from an entirely fabricated photo an experience that had never happened to them, and they couldn't tell the difference between that memory and a real memory, which is fascinating, but leads us to a problem here, right? Because this is Torah. Do we really want to entertain the notion that our memory can be fabricated and undercut their ability to distinguish between false and true? That kind of makes it hard to live by this if we're going to subject it to the same human questions about how memory and retelling works. Marion, did you want to add something to that, or before I went off on that tangent?
That's
We've moved past. Okay,
Right.
the moment is
And
gone.
it wasn't a question.
Okay, no problem. I saw the hand, but
Yeah.
okay. And this is going to come out in the next question. Sefer HaChinuch has something to say about this.
As to the fact that these certain precepts were not mentioned in the first books of the writ like the other precepts.
Right, because we're going to be talking about things later in this that we've touched upon. Things like divorce and things like levirate marriage that were not mentioned in the first telling of the Torah. Those mitzvot don't show up, but they show up here as a retelling. Which, well, I want the telling before I get it seems a little confusing, but Sefer HaChinuch says, don't worry.
Do not wonder about the matter, since the sages of blessed memory said, in many instances, there is no earlier and later, no chronological order in the Torah.
Right? So the fact that it's written way after when it was given doesn't mean it was given. Sorry, the fact that it's written way after other things that are written doesn't mean it was given way after other things that were written earlier. Right? So maybe in the Torah, we talk about all of these mitzvot at Mount Sinai, and then 40 years later, Torah timeline, we're talking about divorce suddenly. That doesn't mean the mitzvah of divorce was given 40 years later. It just means it was written down in a section of the Torah that happened to be contained parenthetically within the narrative of 40 years later. Right? That's a rather strong principle within the rabbinic tradition, that you don't try to understand when something happened just by what page it's on when you're reading through. You have to use other clues for when something occurred in the Torah. Right?
Well, and it comes out with the whole book of Leviticus, which interrupts the whole flow of chronology if you were trying to think chronologically.
Absolutely, and there are other incidences in the book of Genesis that have to do with the narratives of the patriarchs and their families that, if you were just using page order, wouldn't work out so well. And so you have to sort of rearrange the narration based upon the narration's clues, not just what page it's on.
Yeah, Rabbi, is there any thinking on this that just as there is Torah review and interpretation that has been going on centuries, that the current time has an impact on how the Torah is being read to some extent.
To some extent, exactly.
some
It's the to some extent that is always debated and open for discussion.
Absolutely.
But yes.
And so I'm just wondering, given that the 40 years have passed, is there any sort of, I wouldn't suggest that this is the first example of Mishnah, but is there any sort of thought that this is a sort of a re-review of the prior events in an attempt to get to either what actually happened or to get to in terms of what the actual sentiment was,
right. What it
beyond
meant.
the events?
Absolutely. And in fact, Nechama Leibowitz, one of the great Torah commentators of the 20th century, wrote a wonderful essay about this whole section of Devarim that explains that the retelling and the variations in the retelling are precisely for that reason, that the message needed to be highlighted for the benefit of this generation. And that message, the highlighting of the message, not the changing of it, but the highlighting of the message, was going to be different than the highlighting that was necessary for the previous generation. That doesn't change the message, but it changes what you draw the student's attention to, because that student at that moment needs a different emphasis pointed out to them. This is something that we see over and over again throughout the whole books of the prophets, right? The prophets aren't changing anything from Torah, but they certainly emphasize different parts of Torah much more than others, depending upon which prophet or depending upon where they are in their prophetic career. That doesn't mean they're rewriting Torah. It just means today I'm going to focus on X, and I'm going to focus on it with a lot more detail and exposition and exhortation than you see in Torah. Not changing it, not saying this is more important than other stuff, but right now you need to hear this way.
Right, and it often happens with you and your kids when you there's always a whole host of things that you're telling them, but as they are preparing to go spend overnight at somebody else's house.
Right.
You might go through a different list right in their face, like be sure to say please and thank you, and no screaming in their house, and make sure you brush your teeth. You know, whatever it is that you need to make sure
Right.
they're going to do as they go off. And this is the exact same place. They're about to go across without him.
Absolutely. And Rambam is going to go into that in much more detail in just a sec, but we have one last paragraph of Sefer HaChinuch, which tries to answer the question, so why wouldn't God just write everything sequentially? Why not? Why have this? There is no earlier, no later issue. Just if it had all been written down nice and neat sequentially, would that have killed you?
Well, we don't even do that. The root reason
Well,
for
we have flaws that this author doesn't have.
the root reason for this matter, it would seem, is that the Torah embraces all the wisdoms, apart from the plain meaning of its sweet themes and the mighty foundations of its precepts. And perhaps on this account, it is necessary that its sections and letters should be located where they are, all being precisely arranged by the divine master of wisdom, blessed is he. This is an adequate reason.
All right, so imagine you have a box full of tiles, right? Little glass tiles, and there are 1,000 different shades of colors in that box. Now, the OCD among us might sit down and arrange all of those tiles in the precise ordering from lightest shade to darkest shade. Because clearly that is the most logical arrangement for the tiles, right? That you just line them up, or if it's, from different colors in the rainbow, you go through all of your reds, all of your oranges, all of your greens, right? You just work your way through it. Now you have a beautiful spectrum, all done. Or what would the alternative be? To arrange them artistically, to make a mosaic, to make an enormously beautiful picture out of them. Even though that means that the two shades of blue that are close to each other are going to be way apart, because that is what makes the total picture more beautiful and meaningful. So what Sefer HaChinuch is saying here, and it's, if you can't quite capture it from the translation, the beauty of his words, is that he's trying to say the Torah may not fit a logic that we expected, but there is a wisdom that comes from its arrangement, despite those difficulties, that is captured because of this unique arrangement. And that is something that we are then commanded to try and tease out and understand and look more deeply than just, as he put it, the plain meaning of its sweet themes and mighty foundations. Right? So it's not just you memorized all the words and got them in order, it's what emerges from this beautiful and unique pattern.
Continuing with that thought, if you had this beautiful picture and somebody came along and said, I'm going to change that color. I think this color would be much nicer. You look at it and say, that doesn't belong there. Same as you don't add or detract words from the Torah.
Very true. Exactly right. You don't get to go in and recolor one of the tiles just because you think that it would have been better if it had been pink, or it would have been better if it had been green or yellow or whatever it might be. And for those of us who are colorblind, trust me, I'd rather see the picture anyway than the whole order and shades, because I can never do those quizzes. Give me those Pantone color wheels and just get away from me. Okay.
So if you understand the secret of the 12,
Then we're going to come back and unpack this.
Of Moses wrote.
That's a quote, right? These are in sequence, right? The secret of the 12, of Moses wrote.
Of the Canaanites that were then in the land, of on the mount of the Lord there is vision, and of his bedstead, an iron bedstead is now in Rabbah. You will realize the truth about verses 1 through 5 as well.
That's 1 through 5 of our current chapter.
Some say, on the basis of the expression, that very day, that Moses recited the entire book of Deuteronomy to the Israelites in a single day and died on that same day, but he did no such thing.
Okay, so even Ezra is delicately hinting at something that may have escaped our notice, but didn't escape his or the commentators that came before him. The 12 are the last 12 verses of the Torah. Right? They're the 12 finishing verses of the Torah. And Moses wrote, right up again at the end of Devarim, talking about writing down the Torah and Ha'azinu. And the Canaanites were then in the land, from the book of Genesis, right? His iron bedstead, which is now in Rabbah. What's unusual about these phrases? They all imply an authorship long after the text itself is the era of the text itself is describing, right? The Canaanites were then in the land. Well, when Moses was alive, the Canaanites were now in the land, right? We might say the Canaanites were then in the land, but to Moses's audience, the Canaanites were now in the land. They're right over there on the other side of the river. I can see them. So why would you talk about the Canaanites in the past tense if you're Moses and you're writing something down? Again, Moses wrote. Our third person problem. Why would Moses have talked about Moses writing? He just would have said, and then I wrote down these words. The last 12 verses of the Torah deal with what? Moses' death and his burial, and the fact that there never arose another prophet like Moses in all of Israel. How do you write about your own death when you're dead? And B, even if you wanted to say that he would prophetically write about that, would Moses, the most humble man of all time, write that there would be no one like him ever, or has been no one like him ever? He would not, A, have praised himself, and he also would have to be making a rather grand prophecy to say, no, there has been no one like me, or will not have, not has been. The grammar doesn't work well if you posit that Moses himself is writing these things. Right? And also, again, for the iron bedstead, it's now in Rabbah, implying that at the time of this story, it wasn't. Right? So Ibn Ezra is very tactfully hinting that there are verses within the Torah which sound like they were written after the time of Moses, in order to make it understood to a later contemporary audience.
I don't want to be too nitpicky, but
Please,
I went to look at the first one. The Canaanites were then in the land, and that's in Genesis and Bereshit, and it's Abraham. It's the story of Abraham passing through the land. Well, if Moses would be telling the story, Moses wasn't alive at that time. Moses would say, Abraham passed through the land of Canaan. The Canaanites were then in the land. Now we're here in the desert, but they were. That would actually. That's one of the few things that would make sense for him to say it that way.
Except they were then in the land is generally understood to mean, and now they're not. At the time of Moses, but they still were in Canaan at the time of Moses.
Yes.
Because they were the ones that we were going to have to fight in order to settle the land.
So they were there then, and they're still here now.
But that's not, it's not quite, again, there's enough room for wiggle and commentary and discussion. But the idea is, some people have tried to reconcile this, as Ibn Ezra, by just saying, well, Moses wrote it all down, and even though it was prophetic about his own death and whatever, he just wrote it. And Ibn Ezra is saying no. Moses didn't actually pen those verses.
So who did?
So who did? So the general tradition, which is accepted within the Talmud, for the alternative position, because we have both represented within the Talmud, is that Joshua would have written many of the verses after Moses' death. And he would have written many verses during the time of the conquest that would have been for his generation, that were necessary just to help people understand things that were no longer immediately visible or obvious to those generations, right? Like where the bedstead is. You know, it's like, you know that thing we got in Rabbah? That belonged to this guy who nobody's ever heard of anymore except for our book because, well, we kind of wiped them out when they attacked us. So you've never heard of these people except us. It is very similar to when I try to teach someone about the Amalekites. Nobody has heard of the Amalekites except when we describe that we blot out the name of the Amalekites. Right? So when you go to explain that the Israelites attacked the Amalekites, you almost always will add a little comma and say, who were a tribe of raiders that lived in the area of Israel in the ancient world, in comma, and Israel, ... You add that parentheses, that little clause, in order to explain it to a contemporary reader, even though it's something ancient, because otherwise the contemporary reader would have no idea what you were talking about. Like the Amala, who?
Yeah.
Right? just completely unknown for almost everybody outside of people who read this stuff.
Who's the author for the Book of Joshua?
Well, so there's a whole long discussion of how you work this out, of who's the author of which, and you end up with the Book of Joshua being written by Joshua, except for the very end, which was then written by the judges, and you have the Book of Judges written by Samuel. Rather than the judges themselves. We're not sure whether Shimshon even knew how to write. And you get all the way to the end of Samuel, and then you move on to the next level of prophets, the next level, and most of the books of the prophets are assumed to be authored by their own, unless it's the very end of them, and then it's considered to be the disciple or the next generation. So there is a long chain of discussion of exactly how we work out who wrote what.
Well, and this would fit then.
And this fits into that chain, exactly. And that didn't bug anyone. Right? It's not like you needed to have Moses writing, and then just just trails off because that's where he died. And then the next book starts up with, in previous episodes, Moses was still alive, but now we're writing a new book and we're going to tell you how Moses died in this book rather than that book. It's like, no, you're going to append an epilogue or a few emendations here and there in order to make the connection.
Well, and previously, it has been well expounded as to why Joshua succeeds Moses and whose blessing he has to do that.
Yes, with the capital W.
Which, would make the fact that he pens this book a-okay.
Okay, I'm just going to write this up on the board because it's a very good. Is that the right way? My English is not always. Whose blessing, right? Is that's the question. Whose blessing was put upon Joshua that allowed him to write that? So I'm sorry.
It's not unusual.
What?
That's not a usual ring.
You don't have "Night on a Bald Mountain" for your ringtone?
Well, no, I'm used to
Usually
the-
yours
but
is
it's
a
a-
platypus.
Yeah.
No, the platypus is for text messages. The Night on the Bald Mountain is for the ringtone.
Oh, guess
Oh.
I've never heard a ring. Yeah.
And usually it doesn't. I apologize for that. Okay, let's move on because we've got a little bit more of an explanation from Ramban, and then we're going to finish up with the Barbanel's explanation.
Devarim is a repetition of the Torah in which Moses explains to the generation that will enter the land most of the commandments that the Jews will need. He does not mention things that concern only the priests, the sacrifices, and the laws of purity.
Right, because if you've read through Devarim before, we don't get a second copy of Leviticus. We get a second copy of other laws, but we don't get any of the sacrificial laws. Why not?
Which he had already explained to them. The priests were alert and conscientious and would not need such things explained to them over and over again. But Moses does issue the same commandments to the Israelites time after time, whether to clarify details of the law or to simply emphasize them by repetition.
Right, so who decided what went into Devarim? Moses?
Moses.
Right, because Ramban is trying to explain why we have some parts of the Torah duplicated and other parts not. But his basic answer is certain things needed to be emphasized because the Israelites keep messing up with them, and other things didn't need to be reemphasized because we could trust the Kohanim to keep doing okay.
Right.
Later we couldn't, but at this time it didn't bear repeating, whereas the other stuff did.
Right, which goes back to Kathy's point from the parental
Exactly.
metaphor in terms of
I mean, you might need to remind one child of some rules, and you might need to remind a different child of some different rules before they go off.
In this book, for example, one may point to the repeated
Admonishments.
admonishments not to commit idolatry, and the many times he rebukes and even threatens them with severe punishments of sin.
Right? Keep going.
There are, it is true, a few commandments in Deuteronomy that have not been previously mentioned. Levirate marriage, defamation of a virgin, divorce, false testimony, and the like.
There's more than that, but yes. But
All
it's not a
these-
huge number.
All these were told him at Sinai or in the tent of meeting in the first year before the incident with the spies.
Right. So again, going back to Sefer HaChinuch, these are all old laws in the sense that they're 40 years old. It's just they happen to be written down at this point.
Nothing new is given to Moses here in the steppes of Moab, except for the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to conclude with the Israelites in the land of Moab.
Right, which is very, very, very end of the book of Devarim.
That is why we do not find in this book the expression, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, or instruct the Israelites to do such and such a commandment.
Right? So you don't get, and God said to Moses saying. And you don't need to. Why? Because everything that's being said here had already been said before. Even if it wasn't recorded in an earlier part of the Torah, it had already been given. And so now when Moses is saying it, it's a repetition for his initial audience, even though it seems like a first time for those of us who weren't living through the experience of having heard it firsthand at the time. Make sense? Okay.
The reason the new commandments were not mentioned in earlier books for Moses to tell those who left Egypt is perhaps that these commandments, though incumbent on the individual wherever he might be, were not actually practiced until they entered the land.
Now, there's an example clear with regards to libations that can be found in the Bamidbar.
Or perhaps it is because these commandments were not everyday occurrences that Moses did not mention them until it was time for the generation of the children of those who left Egypt to take possession of the land.
Right, so it gives two hypothetical reasons of why the Torah hadn't bothered to record these laws, even though they had been given long before this point. Make sense? And again, who's making the decision of what goes where?
I don't know.
Right? Moses did not mention them until it was time for the generation. Suggests Moses is the author of Deuteronomy.
No.
Well, I find myself thinking, I don't know who the suspect would be, but if I was taking over as a new leader, i.e. Joshua, right, I might want to have my own sort of organization of the previous material that we've already covered, not changing the material, but just in terms of yes, when so-and-so was the supervisor, they emphasized this.
Right.
Now that I'm running the department, it's all the same parameters, but we're going to I just want to remind people, these are the things that are really important to me. Everything else holds, but these are the things that are really important.
Right. The new supervisor is a great analogy, comes into the department and says, I'd like to go over with the department our policy book.
Yes.
And we're not changing anything in the policy book, but the new supervisor may emphasize certain policies more or may give their own exhortation or examples or other forms of attention getting in from discussion. Not changing the policy book, but it still ends up with a different fit and finish than what had been said before.
And not even just so much in terms of the new supervisor, but when you are going to confront a new problem, and these people are going to confront clearly a new problem.
Right.
There are certain policies that are going to be more useful.
Absolutely.
As you go someplace new.
Right. Remember, guys, tomorrow is our IPO, and that means we're going to become a public stock. And let's go over all of our policies and how we're going to handle questions on the phone and all of that. I know you guys all know this, but tomorrow's a big day. So let's make sure we're all on the same page. Makes sense?
Yes.
But who's composing that speech? The same person who made the policy book or the current supervisor?
It sounds like the current supervisor.
And certainly in the analogies we're giving, it would sound like the current supervisor. Because if you were to imagine the person who wrote the first policy book writing a speech that would be said 40 years later when the policy book needed to be reemphasized, we'd all probably scratch our head and go, I'm not sure how well that would work.
Right, but also my response is in the context of the tile metaphor of the tiles being arranged by color. Right, it's not a artistic collage, right? Because it's a lot. It's where the logic would seem to be X, But again, this might be more of a mosaic.
The pun only works in English.
Yeah.
All right. I like the way Abarbanel brings this together for us.
The question is whether this book is from heaven, like the first 4 books, or whether, since it is all in Moses' voice, these are the words of Moses and not God.
Right. So see, we're not afraid to ask these questions in Judaism. Right. We're not afraid to ask, based upon the textual differences, does this change the status of the book of Devarim? And Abarbanel, along with many others, have asked this question and come to conclusions, ultimately, of course, that no, it doesn't change its status. But the way he comes to that conclusion, I think, is very beautiful.
In fact, Moses told Israel all these things because he was soon to part from them.
Right? This is before his death.
After he had finished, the Holy One wanted them as part of the Torah, so he dictated them to Moses, perhaps adding a few things. And Moses wrote them into the Torah at the command of the Almighty, who announced, "These, no more and no less, are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel." The introductory verses, 1 through 5, in the third person, testify that Moses' words in this book are divine, just like the rest of the Torah.
All right. So who wrote this? And Moses. Right? It was written by
Faithful scribe.
Moses was a faithful scribe to God's capturing of Moses' words. Right? So Moses said it first, God approved of what had been said, and Moses then had to record it so that everyone would understand that what he said was approved of as divine by God.
Including those last 12 verses.
We can still argue about those, whether they're written by Joshua or not, because when we come back to the question then of whose blessing is on the text? Right, as it stands, whose blessing is upon the text? God's. Right? That's what is important to hold on to throughout all of the discussions you might hear about the Torah and its authorship. And it's very easy to get caught up, and very interesting sometimes, to get caught up in, well, who wrote which 12 verses? Or what does this mean that it was being written at a time when the Canaanites weren't in the land and that was added by a later scribe? Or, is there the J source and the P source and the E source and, all the other sources? They're fascinating questions, and many of them are very worthy of investigation, and many of them have already been investigated by our sages, and our sages' answers are worthy of investigation as well and retelling. But ultimately, if you remember this, whose blessing is on the final text, all of those questions can be asked without it shaking your world, as you mentioned at the beginning, right? Because the Torah that we have is the Torah that God wants us to have.
Right.
The way that it came to be composed, whether it was all written in one day or whether it was written over 40 years, whether this part was written by Moses and that part was written by Joshua, whether it was written, as the documentary hypothesis people have, over the course of 500 years by people from different towns and cities and different time zones and different concerns, really ultimately can't dent the divinity of the text.
Right.
Because if God has blessed this Torah to be the one that has come into our possession, then this is the Torah that God wants us to have. If God had wanted us to have a different Torah, through whatever mechanism that pen met parchment was involved, we would have had a different Torah, right? If you believe that God is able to act through history in any shape, scale, or form, then the Torah that we have, which is one of the most amazing historical artifacts in all of the world, is a miracle regardless of the mechanism that got the ink to paper.
I was just going to say, it really is, and the other sort of modern day analogy that I was thinking about is, to my read, this could also be viewed as a transition plan of leadership. So that, God begins the plan by saying to Moses, you're not going to lead them in. He then picks Joshua. And then at the end here, he concretizes the things that the new leader should make sure that is aware of as the leadership changes.
Right.
And it really is. It's a fascinating document from that perspective.
Absolutely. And this this then becomes, this wonderful Torah does become a pristine gem and a perfect encapsulation of what God wants us to have to guide our lives. But we have to be willing to open it up, ask questions, wrestle, and work with it if we're going to get the meaning out of it. And we can't treat it as though this is some ancient artifact that's very fragile and delicate and sitting in a case in some museum somewhere that no one wants to ask really questions about, because if you do, you might shatter it. No, this is very, very durable. Open it up, tear into its words, figure out what it's trying to say, ask yourself and it hard questions. You will find good answers. It doesn't need kid gloves, right? This is not something in the British Museum where you got to put on those fancy white gloves and be in the humidity controlled room. No, this is a living, working, and foundational document that you have to treat not just with respect, but with aggressive inquiry, right? Ask of it, and it will produce answers for you. Don't be afraid of it, and don't be afraid of shaking your understanding or belief in it. You can only be more enlightened the further you investigate.
I always, get struck by the transformative effect that Torah has on the life of Moses. That from the beginning, when he was a man of such slow and difficult speech, whatever, to these being the words of Moses in such eloquence and in such clarity, that that this is the effect that Torah has on a human being. And Moses is not some God. He's just us.
And it's important to end just on one slight modification to yours, which is Moses wasn't God, definitely. But Moses understood and perceived God's will in the world more clearly than anyone before or since, which is why this is a unique document for us, and why we don't change its words, and why we don't believe anything, no matter how brilliant that came later, can supersede this. It can embellish, it can inspire, it can guide us in getting deeper into what Torah wants from us. But this process that's being described here between Moses and God, that's non-repeatable. That's not something that's going to happen again, as the last 12 verses of the Torah itself say. So treasure.
Because Moses has that one-on-one experience.
Correct.
We're only going to get it.
Right, and that's actually a big part of what we're going to be discussing, a little commercial. In August, I'm doing a 3-part class about understanding God. Do not think you're going to get Moses's understanding of God, but we'll begin to understand what Moses did and what he saw and how that became transmitted to us is so precious and so good to help the rest of us stand on the shoulders of giants. Because without such a beautiful gem that has been preserved so well, we would all be sitting in the dark. So with that, keep giving the Torah your full attention.
Saturday night, Tisha B'Av.
Yes, Saturday night, as a more immediate commercial, Saturday night, Tisha B'Av, we're having the community service here at 9:30. We are also going to be having a Sunday morning minyan as well for Tisha B'Av here at 9 o'clock. So
How about the sign by your offices? Services at 9 o'clock Saturday.
We had originally scheduled it for 9 o'clock, but in order to be a community service with our friends from SOJC in the South, we postponed it for half an hour to give them more time to arrive.
9:30.
It is definitely 9:30 on Saturday night. And I'll go check that sign and have them make sure that it's correct. Thank you for telling me.